there have been many of us in this country that have been, that their careers have suffered as a result, like myself, as a result of the entire DEI initiative. And that should have never happened. It should have never happened.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome. I'm here today with Tammy Weitzmann, who's a licensed clinical social worker. She's originally from Canada and spent a number of years in oncology and is currently in private practice. And I'm looking forward to a great conversation. So, Tammy, welcome.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
Yeah. So let's start out. Tell me a little bit about yourself. What's your background?
Yeah. So I studied social work. I've been in LCSW for about 26 years now. I was born and raised in Toronto, Canada, and moved to the States legally in 1996, and went back and forth for a little while, but have been in the U.S. for most of my adult life, and now live in North Carolina. Yeah, and work in private practice.
Yeah. One of the things I like to get into, because I feel like the master's level clinician training has gotten so bad in the last 5 years, particularly. I'm wondering, like, when you were going through it, what was the training like?
Yeah. So when I was going through it in my undergrad in Toronto, Canada, where I grew up, it didn't exist what exists today. There was a lot of emphasis on, it being Canada, being, at the time the name was changing from Native Canadians to First Nation people. And so there's a lot of emphasis on that and gay rights. And it was, years after close to shortly after the AIDS epidemic. So that was the focus. It wasn't like today. And even in my master's degree, didn't exist. Didn't exist.
When did you start seeing something? Because I can tell you saw something change in the field. When did it start being from, we're social workers, our job is to kind of help people take care of, those in need, to kind of this grand political strategy?
It really feels like it may have started earlier. It probably did. But to me, I think given what I've experienced in my professional life, it feels like it really clammed down in 2018, 2019, 2020 reached its peak. But my understanding from younger clinicians who had been in school, younger than me, who had been in school, in the sort of, I guess, 2015, 2014, even earlier, it was beginning to get pretty toxic for them, having to denounce their white privilege, the fact that they were born with white skin, having to accept a narrative that not that they didn't believe in, but that they didn't know where it was coming from. And sort of the compelled speech that we know exists within DEI. So I think it was emerging probably earlier than 2015, but that's what I have heard from other clinicians who were in school at that time. But I think I would probably safe to say within the last 10 years.
Mm. And this kind of, social justice backlash or uprising, like it hits you in a very personal way in your life and your career. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah. So, in 2015, I moved after living about a decade in Boston, I moved to Seattle and accepted a wonderful job at a wonderful institution. And around 2018 or so, things began to get pretty hard for me. I think there were some more radical left extremists who, that's my interpretation of them, who I experienced a lot of backlash from them. I was asked to supervise them. And it I was blamed for, things like being white, and I didn't understand why I was being, outcast at first. That's what it really felt like. And there were several distinct incidences that followed throughout that time. Um, I think that eventually, led to all of this chaos that happened for me. But it was a very, I feel, radical climate. It was a very woke climate, but didn't start out that way. It didn't start out that way. I think there were some new staff additions, and they became very, I think they just became very good at activating everyone else to be an activist, right?
Hmm.
This sort of social justice warrior activism that we see that is so prevalent.
What were some of the like things that looked like when they're trying to kind of poke at other people or poke at you?
I was part of course, because it was my department, so I was part of several DEI. It was during COVID, so we met over Zoom, and there was one particular DEI meeting session where everybody in my department and another department were there. So there were maybe about 20 people, a small department. And, the facilitators were asking people to, think about instances in their lives, and they were garnering participation from staff. And I was always, pressed by my boss that I wasn't speaking out enough in these sessions. And these sessions were just so foreign to me. I mean, I think what was so foreign was this force, this really, really strong force that I felt from others in there, that you have to accept this view. Anything else is wrong. So I, now naively, you know, piped up and said, hey, I'm Jewish, I was raised Jewish. I experienced anti-Semitism in my life. And I recalled a story, when I was 17 and I was visiting a friend's home, and her parents were quite anti-Semitic, as I learned. And they didn't tell me to leave the home, but they told my friend to tell me to leave the home. And of course I did. And it was very, very hurtful, of course. And I told that story to illustrate, hey, I know injustice. I know what it feels like to feel hated, And the response I got was, I was flabbergasted by the response that I got. The response I got from the moderators was, doesn't matter. You're white. You can pass. So a total and utter and total disregard for me, my culture, my background, my story that I told, that I risked being vulnerable. There was no thank you for sharing. It was, doesn't matter. You can pass.
Just to bring this back a little bit, this whole, you're being Jewish doesn't matter, check your white privilege, blah, blah, blah. This whole thing is among social workers and oncology. Like, you're helping people with cancer, and this like white privilege thing is just so important right now.
Correct. It was all important. It was all consuming. It was, you know, and that's the problem that I had with it. What does this have to do? In an hour, I'm going to go back and see my next few patients. What does this have to do with people walking into a cancer hospital fearing for their lives, not knowing what any imaging is going to reveal, not knowing what the doctor's going to say, the nurse practitioner is going to say, not living with so much fear and uncertainty. The last I checked, cancer patients are concerned about their lives, not whether you are red or blue or whatever. They're concerned about their lives. And I want to be the best kind of clinician I can for them, to help them through this arduous process, to help them through, their life and death crisis that they're staring at, not talk about my race, not talk about their race, not once in 20, almost 24 years have I ever, ever, ever had any patient or family member say to me, please stop and acknowledge and denounce your white privilege. Never. But it was this agenda that was driven. And the point that I want to make is the agenda was driven so forcefully and with cruelty that if you didn't buy in automatically, there's suspicion that you're a Trumper. There's suspicion that you are, wait a minute, we can't have you here. And that's what it felt like to me. And ultimately, I suffered because of that. I lost my career because of that.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned cruelty and a lot of just like really mean-spirited comments. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, mean-spirited comment, it doesn't matter. You can pass. Well, I'm pretty sure the Holocaust was now 80 years ago. And people who looked like me and spoke like me and maybe different languages, but they couldn't pass. They went straight to the gas chambers. Okay. So no, can't pass. I have a pretty Jewish last name. I don't know that I can pass. But this notion, I mean, they come at it with this self-righteousness, Ryan, and it's so, holier than thou. It's really the whole rules for me or rules for thee, but not for me. It's you have to obey. Um, I was called by another colleague a kike. So also, which is a derogatory term for a Jew. I knew people at the time in the Trump administration personally, closely, and that was learned, in my environment, and I was harassed by that. And when I took that to my human resources department, they didn't really want to get involved because they just said that it would be bad for me if they got involved. They could, but that I would suffer probably retaliation and then, so that I should just really deal with it on my own. And that was very hard for me. It's people I love, and people I love in my personal life. You want to attack the president, everybody attacks the president, right? The president himself knows that everybody attacks him. But don't come after me. Don't come after people that I love and that I know. And so it was very hurtful for me. I felt like I was under a big pressure cooker for a long time. It influenced my emotional health, my mental health for sure. Um, and people would make really snide remarks almost every day, in different environments in the hospital where I worked and because they knew. And people lead at the institution that I worked with, people led with politics, progressive politics, and it's a hospital. Don't lead with that, but it's the environment and it's the culture, progressive politics above all else. It felt like patient care second, progressive politics first, in terms of the environment in which I was living in at work. And that to me is just wrong, really wrong. I'll take it a step further. I'll say that unless you work in a environment that is political, unless you work in some type of a think tank that is, affiliated with the DNC or RNC or whatever it is, don't talk about politics at work. Keep it to yourself. There's no room for that. You don't know if you're going to offend somebody. You don't know if you're going to step out of line, and it always gets out of line.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen so much of that where progressive politics come first. And if we have time later on, we'll talk about client care and what's good for the client. But something I noticed is, and you see this a lot in social justice circles, where the slightest thing that you can do, whether you meant it or not, or whether it even happened or not, if I take it a certain way, I'm allowed to condemn you because you've offended me. But like you were saying, like open ethnic slurs are okay to you because I can say, oh well, you're privileged, so I can unleash pretty much unlimited aggression at you. Like
Mhm.
that seems like such a double standard there.
Such a it's hypocrisy at its best, and it's this self-righteous sort of stance where I felt people were coming from, right? We want to build environments where all voices are heard, not where there's only one voice and one rule of law. And that certainly was not my experience. And it is certainly not okay for one voice to be heard and for somebody else to say, you can't pass. You are negligible. Your story doesn't matter. You don't matter because you know people who are in the Trump administration. You don't matter because I don't know, you're kind of sounding a little conservative to me. I don't know. No, it's that they're reactive. And what you're talking about here is this incredible reactivity that they have. If there's one inkling, one little inkling of suspicion on their part, and their, you know who I mean by their, you're out and you will suffer for it. And that's just not okay. Fast forward to today, where all of these institutions stand on their DEI initiatives, and like that, with a snap of the fingers, they have abolished and taken down all of their DEI initiatives because they don't want to lose federal funding for their mission. So what's their mission? Is it cancer or is it DEI? Is it both? What's their mission? So if it's so easy to take it down and dismantle it, and to me, all of these institutions that are taking their DEI initiatives down, to me, for them, it's almost like giving up their firstborn child. I mean,
Yes.
right? They stand on that like it's holy.
Let me ask you this, because I've seen this with a ton of institutions. Because DEI, social justice, whatever language you want to use, that is their religion. It's their
Yes,
holy and sacred religion. And
absolutely.
something I've seen, I'm talking about I'm here in Austin, Texas, and the University of Texas here. One thing that they did, they had a DEI department. The state of Texas kind of cracked down. You can't have this DEI stuff with any kind of state funding. So they had the exact same office in the same location with the same staff that is now the Office of Belonging. Right. And I'm wondering if you see any of that, just like a rebrand, but it's the same
I was
thing.
wondering, office of belonging, it reminds me of, calling the homeless unhoused, right? I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
let's just call it what it is.
Yeah.
Um, that's interesting, the office of belonging. Yeah, no, I have not heard that. But you wonder how they're going to rebrand their message because, I think there's a group of people, many of us, who think, they may have dismantled it, taken it off their website. We don't really know what's happening internally, right? What I hear from some colleagues is that in some places it still exists, in some places it really doesn't anymore. And they've put out a big PR campaign around how difficult it was to abolish it, quote unquote. I've even heard that some of the larger banks, I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, that some of the larger banks like Wells, Fargo have taken down some of their DEI initiatives and really just kept it focused on neurodivergent folks and veterans because
Interesting.
that's probably more acceptable.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
There's definitely, I feel like in social work and counseling and therapy, a lot of these people are the true believers where it really is like a fanatical, like religious cult to them.
It
But
is.
a lot of corporate America, it's just like DI was just like another line item in the marketing budget. It was just like with all the Pride stuff during Pride Month. It's like, that's just the same as I want to buy the world a Coke or it's just marketing.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. But it is happening thanks to this administration. It is happening. And
Mm.
I think, I mean, no one's been as persecuted, I think, as President Trump, and there've been many of us in this country that have been, that their careers have suffered as a result, like myself, as a result of the entire DEI initiative, and that should have never happened. It should have never happened. And one of the things I will say is that, whether you call them the hard left or radicals or just the left, I really think that they push their agenda very strongly, and then they really overplay their hand. They always, always overplay their hand because then they're riding high at first, I feel, and then they tank because it doesn't work for them. And we've seen that most blatantly in the 2024 election, where, you veer too far one way and the people say, no, that doesn't make sense to us. That's wrong. But I think we need to, from all across this country, from all of the classrooms to all of the cubicles across this country, you know, it's not just about social work, right? It's about every workplace. When DEI, when these initiatives begin to exclude and silence folks, that and compels folks to say things that they don't want to say or don't believe in, that strays from justice, from what I call justice. That is wrong. That is forcing people into, you know, one bucket. And it's cruel and it's wrong.
Yeah. One thing that I see is even if you're a not very radical liberal, you
Mhm.
can get painted as evil because you're not kind of pure enough in the ideology. And if you're able to, like you, if you're able to make some connection to Donald Trump, you're just the great evil of this world. You're essentially a Nazi. Tell me how that type of comparison they were painting you with, like how that played out.
Yeah, so, I think towards the end of my tenure there, the DEI sessions became more and more frequent. And the ultimate example of that is that they terminated me. And the reasons that they gave me for, my termination was just that I think it was that my values weren't aligned with theirs. So,
And they're specifically talking about politics.
that's what I garnered. Yeah, that's what I garnered. Yeah. Because what happened just a few weeks prior to my termination was that one of my colleagues, immediately after a Zoom DEI session, sent an article, pretty disturbing article, that was written, back, I think, in 2016 about the Trump administration that was just starting, when during Donald Trump's first administration. And the article really was talking about influencing your family and friends around the Thanksgiving dinner table to denounce him, that he's cruel, that evil, that, your family is cruel and evil if they believe in this, in him. And and it really wanted to give some talking points on how to do that. And I think it failed miserably. But it was a very cruel article in how it painted people and how it named people. It also said something about Jews in there too. And I took offense to it. I took great offense to it. So much so that I called my manager and I said, listen, this is coming over company email, and this is really, I don't feel that this is okay. And she directed me to speak with my colleague, which I did. And, about a week later, I received a very disturbing communication from my colleague and painting me as, this horrific white privileged person. Um, and she copied, all of the superiors and human resources. Just a few days after that, I was told, that my values don't align with hers. And by the way, do you have a ride home? Because we're letting you go. So bye. And that was the end of my almost 24 years in oncology. And I took it to task and I filed a lawsuit this past year. I'd been working diligently on it for a long time. And this case was resolved last summer, early summer, late spring. And it's behind me now. The actual case is behind me now, but the lessons from it I will always keep with me. And the experience of it I will always keep with me. However, I refuse to allow what happened from that. And I had pretty bad financial repercussions, emotional, psychological repercussions from that. It was a very difficult time for me. But I'm resilient and I got through it and I still am getting through it and I rebuilt my life. I literally pulled myself up and rebuilt my life. And I hope nobody ever has to go through that because what happened to me was wrong. I proved my point. The case was resolved and settled. But it feels really important to me to speak out about the injustice around it. We should have the opportunity in our work environments, in any environment, to be able to eloquently and appropriately speak our mind and not have fear to express ourselves. And that didn't happen.
Yeah. Can you walk me through what the end of that process was like? What can you tell me what some of that stuff, because I remember that was a pretty fiery email that you got.
Yeah, it was. I think when I received that email, it was like a Thursday evening and I was just at home looking on my phone and I was frozen by it. I mean, it was very vicious and it was very, and it was frightening to me but I didn't reach out to her. I was told not to. I just really kind of, stepped back and waited to be spoken to, and proceeded to just kind of do my work. Not much else I could do, right? I valued my job. I loved working with the patients and the staff that I worked with. But of course, it was very disturbing. It was very insulting. It was very hurtful. I never received an email communication like that before from anybody. Um, and I believe, in my experience, that led to the end of my employment.
Mm. Was there more communication that you got from people above you in like managerial roles explaining kind of what had happened?
No, not at all. No.
Mm. I mean, that just seems so bizarre. Like how that all ended. Like that must have been so shocking and jarring for you.
It was very traumatic. It was very traumatic because your work life just ends abruptly and that's what they do, right? And my experience has informed me that they may have felt that I was, more on the other side than on their side. I mean, what they said to me at termination. So I believe that I was terminated because I was Republican, because I'm conservative. That's what I believe, you know. Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's coming up to me is I don't think this is contrary to their values. Because to me, when I look at the National Association of Social Work, or for me, the American Counseling Association, they're pretty upfront about this. They say a key part of being some type of therapist or clinician
Hmm.
is to be a political activist for social justice.
Hmm.
And they pretty much say, either explicitly or implied, numerous times, that if that's not your values, you're really not welcome here.
That's what it feels like. Absolutely. That's how I interpret it as well. And you know what I would say to somebody, to those organizations and to other clinicians out there, whether you are an LMFT, an LCMHC, an LCSW, a PhD in psychology, whatever you are, Here's what I would say to you. If you feel that you need to cancel somebody whose views are different than yours, then you should seek appropriate, unbiased supervision. That's what supervision is for. Of course, the supervision has to be very objective too. They go and seek a woke supervisor. That's not okay. That's just going to feed into their beliefs. Seek supervision because we should all be able to listen to each other. We should all be able to sit around the table and have a conversation. But it's become so fiery, right?
Well, also they kind of control every stage of the process. So if I'm dealing with this type of an issue as a therapist, okay, I go to my supervisor. Who trained my supervisor? Some university system that has those type of radical progressive values. And it's okay, well, I could go to the code of ethics. Well, who wrote the code of ethics? It's pretty much everywhere you go, it's controlled by this social justice narrative.
It is. It is. And I will say this. I will say now that the terrain has evolved a little bit, it's not only our field that has become so woke, it's medicine, it's law, it's all kinds of different professions.
Do you see any kind of tipping point, like people are kind of waking up and saying, like, we don't accept this, or you think it's full speed ahead?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I would have to assume that they're still going to fight. And certainly, not only as long as President Trump is in power, but we are fighting too. I'm not going to let up. I know you're not going to let up. I
Mm-hmm.
know a lot of other people that aren't going to let up. What I believe as a social worker is that I care for all people, all walks of life. That is just who I am. That is why I got into this field, right? I'm going to help you. I'm going to listen to you. If I don't have the expertise to help you or enough knowledge to help you, then I'm going to refer you out. But I'm not going to cancel you and say, because you are XYZ, I'm not going to see you. No, I'm not going to work with you if I don't have the expertise, because then how can I help you? Right? I don't have that training to really help you. But why can't we sit around the table and say, simple as this, you know, I don't agree with your views. Pretty sure you don't agree with mine. Can we just agree on that and move forward together? But that's impossible to do
Mm-hmm.
because DEI has laid the groundwork for this divisiveness. They divide, they silence, they compel, they force. And that's wrong.
So I sense that there's a sea change happening. And there was an article I saw the other day, either New York Times or The Atlantic, I can't remember. But it was basically like, how did everyone fall for, kind of bad science and gender transition with children? And it was kind of like a oopsie, like we messed up. But like those kids are permanently screwed up based on those medical experiments for life. And I feel like there's a lot of people kind of coming out of this haze of like, oops, we made a mistake, you know? And it's like, part of me really wants to have a spirit of forgiveness, but part of me is like, if you fell for all this stuff, I don't know that we should ever trust you on anything again. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. It does. And I like what you said about forgiveness, right? It's not that I can, what happened to me changed the trajectory of my entire career, right? I was not going to go back into a hospital. I was not going to go back into a landmine. And I have to deal myself with the trauma of what happened to me because it was traumatic. But I'm not going to cancel anybody. I don't like, of course, what happened to me, but I fought back and I will continue to fight back. I don't forgive them, but I feel some compassion for these people because they are so angry and they are so fixated on hurting people who believe differently than they do, that's their whole mission. To me, it feels like that's their whole mission.
it feels like some people don't know the difference between justice and vengeance.
Right. Right.
So, so as you're explaining your story, I feel like I can viscerally feel exactly what those situations are like because I've been in similar situations.
Yeah, I know.
But I feel like there's a lot of Americans, if you're like in a small or mid-sized town and you work at like an auto shop or something, you probably don't have any like exposure to a lot of this kind of
Correct.
stuff. You might see it online and like, that doesn't seem like, is that even real? You know what I mean?
Right.
And so I'm wondering if you could walk me through psychologically what it feels like to be in that environment, walk down these halls with that type of hostility. What did it feel like for you?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't only it was the environment in which I lived in too. I lived in the city of Seattle. So, at the time you would go into any kind of a coffee shop, and it was during COVID, and there would be these masks because we were all wearing masks. So certain coffee shops would be selling masks with the red COVID molecules on them with the picture of President Trump, and it said, kill Trump, So it was horrible. I mean, it was
Yeah.
everywhere you turned. It was really, really horrible. And I feel like the city had changed. When I got there, yeah, I knew that I was conservative, right? That I was conservative, but I didn't lead with it. I've never led with it. If I've met people in my life who would say, "Oh, how long you been a conservative for? Oh, how long you been this? How long you been this?" I would answer them, but I didn't, you know, lay down my sword on it. I didn't lead with it. I just, if somebody was really interesting to me, I would talk to them. I would befriend them. Then I learned they had different views than me. I didn't stop being friends with them just because of that. Um, but I've changed since then. I've changed a lot since then because of what happened to me. But it feels very much like a pressure cooker, like you're in this environment, like you're almost behind enemy lines, so to speak. Somebody had said to me, "Well, Tammy, of course something like that would have happened to you in a city like that because you're an enemy, you know, you're an
They
enemy
do
territory."
they do look at you like an enemy.
They
Yeah.
do. They do. They do. And I believe that they feel or felt justified in what they did.
Hmm.
We got the enemy out. How could there be somebody like this amongst us, right?
I remember I was finishing up my undergrad when COVID broke out, and there was a guy. He was actually our chaplain. He was a white man, but every day he would wear like a Black Lives Matter mask, and he would come in like so excited, and he was like, "I triggered a bunch of conservatives," and it's like you don't actually care about black people. You just don't like people who are not like you, which is kind of ironic there.
Terrible. Wow.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah. Did you Did you feel like the tension steadily rising as you kind of went along with these different
Yeah.
events that were kind of building up?
Yeah. The tension was rising, and it really impacted me, and my health and my emotional health and my mental health, and it was very difficult. It was very, very difficult to find, solace and reprieve, but I did what everybody does. Get up the next morning, you rise, you look forward to seeing your patients, you go to work, you get invested in the subject matter of what your work is and hoping that all of that will fade out. Unfortunately, it didn't for me because it was an environment where politics and views felt like they came first before anything else. Doesn't matter what the website of any given institution says. It felt like this is what came first because that is what I encountered every week that I went to work, starting in around 2018, 2019.
Mm. So I'm wondering if you could kind of step back and look at like your experience seems like a very harsh, but like a microcosm of what's happening like across the country in social work.
Yeah.
I talked to Chelsea Smith on here. I think you know her, and she has experiences, with just, I feel like the whole therapy, like clinical world has gone very woke. And I feel like social work is the worst version of that. It's the most rabidly political activist. What can you tell me about social work generally?
So To your point, I do hear from people who have graduated recently. And since my story came out on different media outlets when I filed suit against my former institution, I did receive a lot of emails, comments from people across the country who were fighting similar battles, but in a much more silent kind of a way. And people really being torn down in their MSW programs, really being torn down. By torn down, I mean having to denounce the fact that they were white, never mind if they were a male who was white. But if, I'm talking about a lot of women came forward, and relayed some of their experiences to me. Just every now and again, I'll still continue to get more, um, you know, some communication from people who have read my story and have, you know, um, expressed what they've been going through. But yes, people very much being torn down in MSW programs. And it's like, who gives them the right to do that? And it is now in Canada too. It wasn't at the time, certainly when I was growing up. But yes, I have a very close friend of mine, a childhood friend whose daughter just graduated from a reputable school, and she faced much of the similar things that you and I are just talking about now, but adding to that very much because she's Jewish and very much a lot of anti-Semitism. So it may have changed now a little bit towards October 7th, but and pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamasnik, as I call them. But I think it still exists, where if you don't sing the narrative, then you're going to suffer.
I'll talk about the Jewish thing for a second because this is one of the things that seems so bizarre. Where kind of this pyramid of like intersectional hierarchy seems kind of fluid and it can shift. So like a couple generations ago, people like Jews and East Asians, you had the Chinese Exclusion Act, you had Jews with the Holocaust. You say this is a marginalized population, this is a vulnerable population group who's faced discrimination and all this stuff. And it seems like both those groups, because they've had more success in recent years, oh, now we're going to swap that out. Now you're like white adjacent, you're part of multiracial whiteness, all this stuff. That's got to be a little confusing for you.
It's not only confusing, I think it's just crazy. I think it's just absolute crazy talk. Um, of course, people know that Jews are one of the most persecuted groups on earth, right? But the woke the hard left are looking at skin color. You know, I don't know how much more obvious you can get if you are Asian, right? You're also you're also a minority. I don't know why they are being, um, excluded or canceled if they are. I don't know, but certainly DEI does not take Jews into account at all. At all. And my case in point. But, because what they're looking at is they're looking at me and they're looking at my white skin. They're not looking at my ancestors and what happened to my ancestors, right?
I feel like, for centuries, there's been this push to get us to adopt deeper and more complex ways of looking at the world. An expression I'm thinking of is don't judge a book by its cover.
Mhm.
And then these kind of postmodern thinkers who are supposed to be more sophisticated than the rest of us, their great ideas. How about we just do judge books by their covers? That's kind of their big idea.
Mhm. Yeah, and they do. They really do. They really do. They would say the same about us, but they can say whatever they want. They're entitled to, you're entitled to say whatever you want, but you can't threaten and can't be cruel and you can't be mean. And when somebody behaves like that, that gives me information about who they are, and it gives me information about where I want to be in relation to them. And that is not near them, right? I don't want to be around people like that. I'm not like that. You're not like that. I don't want to surround myself with that. There's so many other things that they can focus on. They can focus on their climate change. They can focus on so many different things in the world and the environment, but they focus on Donald Trump and they focus on people who support Donald Trump and they focus on people who they think may have an inkling of support for him. Leave those people alone. Leave them alone. Focus on your own life. There's so much hatred. I mean, I don't know if you can hear and feel the hatred behind their words. I mean, half the time I don't know if they know what they're saying, really, but you don't get to come in and say, I'm more superior than you. You don't get to do that. Nobody gets to do that. I don't get to do that. You don't get to do that. No group gets to do that. We should all be working towards workplaces, classrooms, environments that truly foster like a no fear environment where we can all speak our mind, where we can be polite, where we can be, accepting of each other. I don't agree with you. I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't agree with you, but hey, we're still friends kind of thing, right? That's equity. That is really building community in my sense, in my world. But that'll never happen. It sounds like I'm talking about, a very idyllic
Yeah,
space, right?
utopia.
Utopia. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's what it should be. It should be like, hey, you know what? I'm disappointed. My guy didn't get in. He didn't get into office this year, and your guy did. So I hope for the best for him, right? I didn't wish President Biden, any ill will. I hope that he succeeded, you know. Um, but I am proud of this administration, and I will say that very proudly. They hold some values that I have walked in my life, and especially with what has happened to me over the last, 4 years, I know that this administration understands that. I know they understand the experience of somebody being canceled, their career being canceled, because they have certain beliefs, because they believe a certain way. Nobody looked at my work record and say, hey, exemplary work record, by the way, Tammy. Gosh, really, from all your physicians, from all of your team members. But you know what? We're gonna let you go because, you think this way. No, nobody said that, but nobody took into account my background and on paper and from, all the different feedback that managers received about me over the years. Nobody took that into account. They just decided with the stroke of a pen that they didn't like possibly what I stood for. So you're out. We can't do that to people. These are people's lives, livelihoods, families, reputations.
So something I've noticed, I'm pretty moderate in my politics. I'm not really Democrat or Republican. I kind of try to see things from different perspectives, you know. And when I say that to a Republican or conservative, they say, "Wow, it sounds like we have a lot of common ground. It sounds like we could have a conversation."
Mhm.
And when I say that to people on the left, it's like, "Well, you're worse than Hitler." You know, I feel like there's that big difference where, sometimes I feel myself leaning towards the conservative side just because they're nicer in a lot of ways, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. It makes a lot of sense to me because, the left is just so reactive, you know, and just, you know, don't be reactive. That's what I would say. Don't be reactive. Get a lot of supervision around your reactivity. There's so many things, again, there's so many things that they can focus on in life. There's so much to focus on in this big, beautiful world of ours. But they choose to focus on, you know, on people who don't believe what they believe and who they deem injustice, what they deem injustice. And really, they talk about, Ryan, we haven't spoken about the safe spaces, right, that they've created. Well, it's only safe spaces for people who believe what they believe. I wouldn't be welcomed into their safe space. I don't know that I'd want to be welcomed into their safe space, but I wouldn't be welcomed into their safe space, right?
You have to tiptoe around me and make sure you don't accidentally do anything that might potentially offend me, but I can use openly ethnic slurs against you. Right? It's a very double standard there.
Right, right, right. Correct. A very double standard, and I will never cease to say it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong. People should not, what has happened to people's behavior? What has happened to people's behavior? And these are people who are taking care of people. There was I don't know who the clinician is, but there was in North Carolina, on several Facebook groups, there was a clinician who came out saying shortly after President Trump was elected in November that she would not accept any maggots in her practice.
Like as clients?
As clients, yeah. Yeah. And she spelt it Maggotts, I believe.
Like a maggot.
Like a maggot. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Referring to the MAGA movement. Right.
Yeah.
So that is really, that was just unbelievable. I know that a lot of people in the community complained, and I think I haven't seen this individual back on the sites, but that is just coming right out and saying who you are. Similar to a physician who takes an oath, I really believe that we take an oath to, again, serve all people of all communities. But again, I won't be able to serve you if I don't have the expertise to serve you, if it's not my area of expertise, right? A lot of areas that aren't my expertise. I'm not an expert in autism. I'm not an expert in ADHD. I'm an expert in, medical issues and grief, in anxiety and depression. But, I may need to get some more training on that if I want to serve those other populations. But, right?
I just have so little sympathy for that position of like, I'm not going to treat anybody whose politics are different than mine. I've had clients over the years whose politics ranged from communist to libertarian and everything in between. And I've had a lot of people who were difficult for me to work with because of things about them. I've worked with rapists, people who were into child pornography, things that really stirred up some big feelings within me. And I have to say, okay, I'm going to put this over on the side. My duty right now is to help you get better. And on some sense, I think in some of those cases, there's like an added motivation. Because if somebody's causing a lot of harm in their life, I think that's even more reason for me to help them, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. And what I always say, and what I say to people who are, sort of younger in the field, and I will never stop saying this, is focus on the work, right? Focus on the clinical work. What are you treating? And if it's a really, really difficult case and you still want to stay with it, get your clinical supervision from somebody who has expertise in this particular area. That's a really hard area to work in, So I have people, I see people from all walks of life with all different pronouns, and I respect that, whether I personally agree with it or not is not an issue. My issue is, how can I help you? Of course, I'm going to accept you. And of course, I'm going to hear you out. And of course, I'm going to work with you because I want to, because you came to me for help. And if I can help you, I will. I'm not going to judge you. There shouldn't be judgment. And there's a lot of judgment we see from our peers and our colleagues on the left. There's a lot of judgment.
Yeah. So I have two questions left for you. And one is, when you look at kind of the mental health space, the clinical therapy, that type of space, how do we begin to fix that?
I don't know. I'll be really honest. I don't know. It's really sad what has happened. It's really, really sad. To me, it's very sad. the evolution of the field over time and what has happened. I wish and my hope is that by continuing to speak out, that we can all create a different environment. We can help change the environment. Can't help change people, but maybe we can help change the environment. Maybe some people can glean some insights into some of the things. But I believe that it is our duty to continue to speak out, certainly about our own experiences, our own personal and professional experiences, and what has happened to us in this field, because it's part of our life story and it relates to our field. And I certainly wouldn't want to encounter somebody who is so biased in one way. I wouldn't want to be at the end of their, you know, um, of their screen if I was doing virtual work with them or opposite them, because that's judgment, because they're judging me, right? So, you know, I think the only thing that we can do is continue to fight the good fight and talk about how we would like to change things and try to make some inroads. Small inroads, hopefully over time will create larger inroads. That's that's the only thing that I can think of off the top of my head. Yeah. But it saddens me a great deal that there is this, that it's become like, oh, we fight, we fight, we fight. Yeah, we fight, but we also have to honor the work that we're doing. And we have to honor, you know, the code that we undertook, which is really to, you know, not be judgmental and be accepting of people and say, hey, if I can't work with you, it's really because I don't have that expertise. So either I get some training and we come back, or I refer you to somebody who would be a much better fit. That should be the reason we don't work with people.
I like that. I like that. So my final question is, when you kind of look at society more broadly, like beyond just the stuff we're talking about today, or it could include that, but when you look at society, what is one issue that we're not talking about enough that we should be talking about more?
Mm. Hard question. Good question. I obviously am very passionate about this entire DEI sphere, and I think I think we need to talk about it more because it can come right back to us, you know. There could be I hope there won't be another administration in 3.5 years, but if there is, and it's not an administration that I would vote for, DEI comes right back. DEI comes right back, Ryan. And just like your office of belonging, I mean, I don't know if people are going there to feel like they belong. I don't know what they're doing, but I don't think that it hurts us to continue to talk about, you can't cancel me because you don't like my views. You can't cancel me because you don't like what I look like. You can't do these things. You just can't. And yet it continues to happen. So I think we need to continue to talk about it and educate people around not only how unfair it is, but how it's destroying communities because it's dividing communities. And we want everybody to have a voice. Let's, you know, let's not create division. Let's create more unity. But we can only do that if we talk about it. And I'm telling you, if we can't really let our guard down around the DEI stuff, because it can flourish again, and it will. I believe that it will. So I would like for people to be open and honest, and I would like for people to be respectful of other people. And really say, if you're a clinician, really say, gee, I won't work with you because I don't have the training. I'm not an expert in autism. I'm not an expert in attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, right?
Mm.
Not because I don't like your views, right?
Yeah. Well, Tammy, I love this conversation. Thank you
Thanks
so
so
much for
much.
joining me. I would love to talk
Sorry.
to you again sometime.
You got it. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye.